Hello, everyone. Welcome back to Progressive Republic. I'm your host, Landon Mitchell. Progressive Republic is a podcast devoted to discussing leftist perspectives online. Today, I'm here again with a very great friend of the podcast, Professor Matt McManus. He's a professor at Spelman College, and he's written books such as The Political Theory of Liberal Socialism. Today, I brought Matt onto the podcast to discuss the philosopher Friedrich Nietzsche and his political views. Matt, could you please start off by giving us some of your background on your work on Friedrich Nietzsche?
Sure. Well, I first started reading Nietzsche when I was about 18 years old. I'd been raised Roman Catholic, was quite devout, altar boy, Christian summer school, the whole lot, right? And as so often the case, I started questioning my faith, and perhaps inevitably that led me to the Nietzsche section, or at least the Nietzsche philosophy section in the chapters near where I lived. And for a little while, I became pretty militantly convinced that he was right about more or less everything, both about Christianity and more generally. Since then, I've become a lot more skeptical of many of his views, particularly his political views. That said, I still think Nietzsche is a fascinating thinker who anybody could read, if not with profit, at least with a great deal of insight.
Definitely. So, to start broadly, do you think there is something like a Nietzsche war going on today, a struggle between the political left and right over who gets to claim Nietzsche's intellectual legacy? Who, if anyone, has the stronger claim to Nietzsche's legacy?
Well, I think here it's important to go backwards in time a little bit to get a sense for where this war you're talking about came from, right? Early in his career, Nietzsche was actually something of a nobody, right? If you look at near the end of his mature life, he was writing books rapidly. One year he published 5 books alone, but nothing really came of it, right? He didn't have much of a reputation. But right before he descended into madness, he was starting to get intimations of his later fame, particularly when figures like Jorge Brandes from Denmark wrote to him describing his philosophy as aristocratic radicalism, and then later on giving a series of lectures that really inspired many people to take Nietzsche seriously, and that helped make his name on the European continent. And actually, early in the 20th century, most people did understand that Nietzsche was a political thinker, and that's because so many political movements tried to claim him and his legacy, not least German nationalists, and later on, of course, the fascist parties of Europe that emerged in the 1920s. So you'd have figures like Bertrand Russell, for example, describing the Second World War as, and I quote, Nietzsche's war, because of the association that so many people made between Nietzsche and Nietzscheanism and National Socialism and fascism, et cetera, et cetera. Then later on, especially in the English-speaking world, you really saw this dramatic pivot away from interpreting Nietzsche as a political thinker. And this was largely the result of the rise of existentialism. People like Jean-Paul Sartre, Simone de Beauvoir, et cetera, et cetera. And figures like Walter Kaufmann, who was essential in translating Nietzsche into English and popularizing his work for a wide audience, really worked hard to situate Nietzsche in the tradition of existentialism, but in quite a obviously apolitical way, right? If you need Kaufmann's book, for example, on Nietzsche, he really interprets him first and foremost as a psychologist, a theorist of nihilism, somebody who tries to develop very personalized ways of dealing with the threat of the meaninglessness of life, but doesn't really have too much to say about politics. And for a very long time, in no small part because Kaufmann's translations have been so vital for English-speaking readers, this was just taken to be the right view of things. You know, Nietzsche was kind of a bohemian intellectual who offers you spiritual guidance on how to deal with the problems of life without needing to turn to religion. Yeah, he had the odd political comment here or there, but the idea was nothing of significance. Then, starting in the 1960s and 70s, you saw a further shift, which, and this gets to your point, once more made Nietzsche into a political thinker, but now very oddly into a thinker that sits most comfortably on the political left. And the main figures who are responsible for this are the post-structuralist or postmodernist thinkers in France that are coming out of the 68 insurrection, right? You think about people like Gilles Deleuze or Michel Foucault. Both of them were hugely influenced by Nietzsche in their own ways, particularly Foucault, who actually identified as a Nietzschean in the 1970s. And the way they really read Nietzsche is as a very subtle genealogist of power, obviously, but also as fundamentally a deeply illiberal thinker. But an illiberal thinker in a sort of left-wing way, right? Somebody who is a critic of bourgeois moralism, about sexuality, about the market, about all kinds of Judeo-Christian values that he offers us resources to help reject. And that was really the view of Nietzsche that persisted for quite a long time, especially in the academy. It's the one that I kind of came up in the 2000s and 2010s, right? Everybody kind of read Nietzsche through a fairly Foucauldian, if not Deleuzian, lens. But now you're really starting to see things shift back to the way that they were in the 20th century. And there are a few different catalysts for this, but one of the big ones that you just mentioned is the fact that so many far right and hard right thinkers have cited Nietzsche as an influence and claimed him as one of their own. And you're starting to see left wing thinkers like myself, like Daniel Tutt, who've said, yeah, you know what, actually, Nietzsche is fundamentally a right wing thinker. There's just really no denying that. That doesn't mean that left wingers can't read him profitably. In fact, there's a lot you can learn from Nietzsche as a left winger. But it does mean that to invoke Tut, you have to read him parasitically against his own intentions.
Right. So, one of Nietzsche's most famous distinctions is between master morality and
Mhm.
slave morality. Could you explain what Nietzsche means by these two forms of valuation, and why does he think that the slave revolt in morality, the so called slave revolt in morality, was such a consequential transformation in Western culture?
Sure. Well, the primary place where this is articulated is the genealogy of morals, which, along with the Thus Spake Zarathustra, is considered to be one of Nietzsche's two most important books, at least in the scholarship. And in the first essay of Thus Spake Zarathustra, Nietzsche says that he's going to interrogate the origins of these concepts, good and evil. And when he looks back in time, what he says is that if you go to antiquity, what you see is the aristocracy that gets to make determinations about ethics. And this itself was really quite a radical perspective, which is one of the reasons why people like Foucault are later on going to be so influenced by him, because Nietzsche does not take for granted the idea that good and evil refer to anything immutable and eternal. And he certainly doesn't think that good and evil are separate from who has power in society. What he says is the concepts of good and bad, and that's not quite the same as good and evil, originated because the aristocracy praised themselves, right? They saw themselves as noble, healthy, powerful, virile, and they consequently described everything that was good in terms of themselves, the way that you would, Nietzsche thinks, if you were a healthy and perhaps somewhat narcissistic specimen. And by contrast, bad wasn't evil, right? They was just a set of values and a set of qualities that Nietzsche says the aristocrats associated with the slaves and the underlings. Unhealthy, weak, pitiful, by and large sick, not particularly intellectually inclined, all this kind of negative qualities. But Nietzsche points out that the aristocracy, again, did not see the slaves as evil. If anything, they had a kind of, to the extent they felt pity for them, and they didn't feel much pity, it was kind of almost a, thank God I'm not a slave type mentality, right? So this is master morality, right? This kind of very virile, Nietzsche thinks oftentimes quite healthy, satisfied view of your life. And quite notably, Nietzsche tends to imply that while the figures who created master morality had deities, it's also not a coincidence that the deities that they invented, people like Zeus or Hera, looked an awful lot like aristocrats, right? They kind of molded them in their own image, and they, of course, had very similar values to what the aristocracy had. Well, flash forward, and what you have are the slaves, right? And Nietzsche is quite insistent that the slave class in a society can often become the more intellectually and spiritually clever class in society. And sometimes he's even begrudgingly admiring about this. And I should also add, there's an awful lot of anti-Semitic commentary in the genealogy of morals, right? Where he talks about the Jews, for instance, as a slave class in the Roman Empire, and how their influence has kind of worked its way into the world. Something that, again, has recently been rediscovered by critics of Nietzsche who are trying to point out the origins of things like right-wing anti-Semitism. But anyway, Nietzsche points out that the slave class wasn't able to physically overcome the masters, and they also lacked the courage to try, right? This is a very important thing. And this means that a lot of the aggressive energies that they felt towards the masters had to initially be turned inward. And they turned inward in such a way that the slaves were forced to think very, very hard about their value systems, about their consciousness, about their mental states, et cetera, because there's no way of externalizing a lot of these aggressive energies that they feel. But over time, what Nietzsche says is the slaves were able to accomplish something extraordinary. They talk a lot of the resentful feelings they felt towards the aristocrats, this desire to be an aristocrat and never being able to actually achieve this. And they're able to use a Freudian term, sublimate those feelings into slave morality. And suggest that actually all the kind of values and qualities associated with the slaves, far from being bad, were in fact good. But now they develop their much more innovative idea, because rather than suggesting that the slaves are good and the masters are just bad, right? These kinds of pitiful or weak figures, they insist that in fact the masters are evil, right? That there's something morally contemptuous about them or morally fallen about the masters. And the clearest example of this Nietzsche gives, of course, is Christianity, which he sees as the slave morality par excellence, right? Where the masters emphasize the importance of pride as good. Of course, you're going to see Christians and Christian slaves characterize pride as the first sin, right? It's the sin of Lucifer, where you're going to see the masters regard pity as very much a questionable value, unless it has this kind of noblesse oblige quality to it. Of course, the slaves are going to emphasize pity as the most important of all values in some respects, right? You're supposed to show pity for the weak, pity for the sick, pity for the poor, and that demonstrates, that you are chosen by the kingdom or by God, right? And this, of course, Nietzsche says is a remarkable inversion in the value systems that he thinks initially at least govern the world. And what's quite notable is that over time, because the slaves were more clever and more determined in many respects, they were able to triumph over the masters. And he says there's no clearer indication of this than the fact that the Roman Empire that once ruled the world and kind of embodied master morality no longer exists in its secular form, or at least in its pagan form. Now, if you go to Rome, at the epicenter is, of course, the Roman Catholic Church. It's the Christians that govern the Roman Empire now. And he thought this was just a calamitous achievement of sorts.
So let's turn specifically to socialism. What, in your view, is Nietzsche's fundamental critique of socialism? What did he think was wrong with the socialist project, not just politically or economically, but at the level of its underlying values?
Well, Nietzsche thinks there's a lot of things that are wrong with socialism, right? I mean, he never misses a chance to take shots at it whenever he can, right? His famous characterization of socialism in The Will to Power, which is a posthumously published manuscript organized by a sister, is socialism is Christianity with a residue of Rousseau, right? A kind of secularized Christian morality that doesn't necessarily believe in God, since most socialists don't believe in God. But Nietzsche would say that even if socialists don't believe in God, it's absolutely the case that socialists believe in the Christian God's message, his moral message in particular, since in many ways they kind of embody and carry that forward. And Nietzsche had many criticisms of socialism that he offered, which vary quite wildly, right? Sometimes he implied that the problem with socialism is that since it was based upon a crypto resentment that it disavowed, the socialists claim that what they want to do is bring about a world of peace and brotherhood for everyone, when really what they want to do is fleece the rich. They're motivated by resentment deep down. He suggested that what's going to happen if the socialists come to power is there's going to be enormous forms of tyranny that the world has ever seen. And it's worth giving the devil his due here and saying that Nietzsche wasn't entirely wrong about that. If you look at the Soviet or Maoist experience, right, where people who own private property, were deliberately starved to death by the powers that be, to kind of stick it to them as a lesson. Sometimes he actually suggests that even if socialism does achieve all its ambitions and doesn't lead to tyranny, that's still going to be bad, because what you're going to have is the state or civil society that is ensuring that everyone is happy and everyone is contented, which he regards as a kind of lifestyle that's fit for cattle, right? Or other kind of herds and animals that don't particularly want to feel compelled to strive for anything that's magnificent or challenging. They want everything to be lowered to the most base common denominator. And, sometimes he'll lump all these things together also. Just to give one example, in The Twilight of the Idols, where he's talking about Christianity and its offshoots, You suggest that socialism is very similar to liberalism, which is very similar to Englishmen, which is very similar to feminism, which is very similar to democracy. All these things are kind of linked together. Now, and he repudiates or disavows all of them. Now, this might seem shocking to a lot of socialists who are convinced that liberalism is the antithesis of socialism, right? But one of the things that Nietzsche would say is that actually liberalism and socialism are both rotten fruit from the same Christian tree. The liberals might frame their demands for emancipation and equality in terms of the rights of man, which Nietzsche also held in contempt. Socialists might frame it in terms of expropriating the expropriators to create the worker state or the socialist utopia. But in the end, the ambition is all the same, right? To empower the herd animals and human beings.
Right. There's an interesting criticism of Nietzsche's politics I'd like to get your take on while we're on the subject of liberalism. If the Übermensch is someone who's capable of exceptional independence, creativity, and self overcoming, why wouldn't such a person actually have an interest in liberal democracy? Liberal democracy protects individual rights and gives exceptional individuals considerable freedom to pursue their own projects. So, does the Übermensch actually need liberal democracy for protection and flourishing, even if Nietzsche himself was deeply critical of democracy and liberalism?
Well, some people have tried to argue that, right? I mean, there's a long history of liberals and socialists trying to read Nietzsche against himself to imply that you can kind of reconcile Nietzscheanism with their own doctrines, right? So today you have people on the right, like Richard Hanania, who will describe themselves as Nietzschean liberals, right? And understand the market is a kind of competitive mechanism that will allow certain kind of exemplary figures to rise to the top and in so doing produce all the wonders of the world that the rest of us benefit from. Uh, Other socialists like Trotsky, for example, have tried to reject Nietzsche, but by taking on board his criticisms and saying it's actually not the case that under socialism or communism, what we're going to have is a kind of race to the lowest common denominator kind of human being. Instead, under socialism, all human beings are going to be elevated. In a famous quote, Trotsky implied that under communism, human beings, the general character of human beings is going to be so elevated that the average person is going to rise to the level of an Aristotle, a Marx, et cetera, et cetera. And beyond that, further horizons are going to appear. Uh, so that's one way you can try to respond to these things. I just don't think it's all that convincing if you're going to imply that that's what Nietzsche himself would have believed. Nietzsche did have a period around the middle of his intellectual career where he had a few nice things to say about liberalism, particularly the freedom of speech and inquiry that it permitted people. But by his mature period, he's very, very unambiguous that liberalism, as he puts it, is a philosophy fit for cattle and Englishmen. No one else could possibly want any of it. And the reason is he has very little patience for anybody who thinks that the doctrine of the equal rights of man, which he calls a poison, has any kind of should have any kind of currency in a higher form of society. And there are a lot of different reasons for this. Just to quote one example in Beyond Good and Evil. In Beyond Good and Evil, Nietzsche makes very clear that what he's looking for is an aristocratic society, because he says only an aristocratic society has ever been able to elevate the culture in any meaningful way. And beyond that, he says that clearly an aristocratic culture is going to need to depend on slavery. The slave class needs to exist to provide the material basis for the Lord's flourishing. But beyond that, Nietzsche's not a Marxist. He says a kind of inverse Marxist even. Beyond that, Nietzsche says, look, it's not just important for there to be slaves so the masters have the leisure time to pursue these great projects. The masters also need to get used to using the slaves as cannon fodder. There needs to be a pathos of distance, is one of his favorite terms, that emerges between the masters and the slaves that helps to cultivate this aristocratic sensibility. You can't have that in a society where everyone is nominally equal because they have equal rights, and you certainly can't have it in a social society where everyone are supposed to be brothers and sisters.
Okay, so here is the last question that I have for you.
Mhm.
Silicon Valley has increasingly produced figures who seem to present themselves as Nietzschean, Übermensch, and people like Peter Thiel or Elon Musk. They see themselves as kind of transcending ordinary human limitations through wealth, technology, and ambition. But when we look at the lives and ultimately the fate of these billionaires, does that undermine the idea that wealth, power, and technological mastery can produce the kind of higher human being that Nietzsche envisioned?
Well, I think that if Nietzsche were alive today, he would characterize many of these people who invoke his themes as remarkably superficial, right? There was an interview with one of those tech billionaires not too long ago where I pointed out that he's not reflective at all, that he just acts and then kind of lets the chips fall where they may. That was not Nietzsche's ideal at all, and it's a serious mistake to assume that. Um, at various points, Nietzsche actually suggests that one of the few achievements that Christianity has given the world, and it's very few, has been a deepening of the soul of human beings, which is an improvement on the old kind of aristocratic flatness that you see in people like Achilles, for example, in the Homeric Ethics. And sometimes he'll posit his ideal not as Caesar or Achilles, but as Caesar with the soul of Christ, right? This kind of figure who is definitely beyond good and evil and is not going to be characterized by excessive sentiment or compassion, but is nonetheless deeply reflective and aware, and indeed self aware of what they are doing, and is cultivating their own value system in a very clearly philosophical or at least artistic kind of fashion. So, from that standpoint, a lot of these Silicon Valley gurus who are remarkably superficial in terms of their inward psychology and have an grossly impoverished understanding of human beings would probably strike him as vulgar. Nietzsche loved nasal metaphors. He'd probably say that they really smell and reek of this kind of desperate yearning for the masses' attention and for the adulation of the most lowest common denominator figures. And they hope to achieve this through things like technological innovation, which Nietzsche would see as a very plebeian instinct ultimately. So there's no doubt that many of these figures in Silicon Valley adopt a kind of pseudo Nietzschean or vulgar Nietzschean or fourth rate Nietzschean kind of perspective on these things. He himself was much more interesting than any of them, I think, really have the capacity to be.
Right. So I have one final question, actually. So after everything we've discussed, Nietzsche's hostility to Christianity, socialism, democracy, liberalism, um, what do you think Nietzsche gets most right about modern politics, and what does he get the most wrong?
I think the thing that he gets most right is an awareness of the fact that resentment is at the basis of many forms of contemporary politics. And very often, this resentment is disavowed and sublimated into various moralistic forms. I think you see that very prominently in certain forms of left wing politics. For instance, when people say that the primary reason that they're socialist or communist is because they want to eat the rich. Now, don't get me wrong. As my previous comment implied, I don't have a lot of good things to say about the rich, especially now. But our goal should be justice, not vengeance. And I think too often, in the way that Nietzsche predicted, the left will suggest that what we're after is justice, and what we're really after is revenge, or at least sticking it to the people that we don't like. That said, this is also what I think it gets most wrong about politics. Wendy Brown has, the important feminist political theorist, has a very sharp critique of Nietzsche in her book In the Ruins of Neoliberalism, where she points out that if you read Nietzsche's genealogy of morals, he almost always seems to imply that resentment is only the property of left wing causes. And it can only exist in the slave classes of society. Now, without doubt, the working classes and the slave classes and the marginalized of society can feel an enormous amount of resentment. But what Brown points out is, especially today, it's very clear if you look at political terrain, most of the resentment is very much on the political right end of the spectrum. And this is because she points out that what Nietzsche never really made himself aware of is the fact that dispossession or a feeling of dispossession can very much be a catalyst for a feeling of resentment. Think about something like the MAGA movement. These are very often people who come from positions of relative privilege, even if they're not the richest in the world. And their constant anxiety is that their country or my country is being taken away from me. My money is being taken to be given to people who I regard as unworthy. These shithole countries that I hold in contempt and apparently can't accomplish anything are somehow still mysteriously taking advantage of us and fleecing the United States day in and day out. All of this is very clearly a kind of victim morality based in resentment, but it's not a resentment that you would say is associated with slave morality. It's resentment of dispossession because these are people who consider themselves masters or who have been masters for a very long time and who find it profoundly anxiety inducing to imagine that they would have to share power or wealth, etc., with anyone else. So to Brown's point, I think that he made a very serious error in assuming that only marginalized movements and only the left could be motivated by resentment. I think today it's very clear that no one feels more resentment towards pretty much the entire world, and no one is capable of more pathetic self pity than somebody who wears a red hat with a MAGA flag on it.
Right. So one last question, I suppose, in these last few minutes. So Nietzsche, interestingly, he does say that the anti-Semites of his time were motivated by resentment. Right. I think
Mhm.
he has a really provocative quote about it. Doesn't he say the anti-Semite is actually the dumbest Jew or something like that?
Yeah, absolutely. So again, Nietzsche's relationship to anti-Semitism is complicated, right? Again, if you read his work, it's filled with references to the impact of Judaism. He'll often imply that Christianity is just a kind of bastardized form of Judaism, and that the Jewish triumph over Western civilization has been a disaster. That said, what he's talking about is a kind of cultural sensibility that he aligns with the Jewish people, at least at their origin. He was deeply contemptuous of the kind of conspiratorial anti-Semitism that was emerging amongst German nationalists at the time, and that included, I should add, amongst his sister. Right, his sister was a proto-Nazi, later on a Nazi. Right, she brought Hitler to Nietzsche's house in order to kind of connect her brother falsely to his viewpoints. And Nietzsche was also deeply contemptuous of anything that smacked of a kind of a biological anti-Semitism. That's not to say that Nietzsche wasn't above a little bit of eugenic style thinking here and there. He often talks, for instance, about the need to breed the master race. But he wouldn't be inclined towards this idea that you're going to toxify or sully the blood of the nation through Jewish presence, the way that the Nazis later would. So I want to make very clear one last time this tendency to engage in what Lassuto called a hermeneutics of innocence around Nietzsche to try to downplay some of the really horrible things that he said is something that we really need to move past. I think that a lot of leftists find it difficult to accept that they find Nietzsche a very interesting thinker while also squaring that with the fact that he said many things that were extremely reactionary, often deeply, deeply genocidal, and without a doubt, very, 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 very pro-slavery. There was a study done recently where I think they said that Nietzsche talks about slavery hundreds of times, and every single one of them is affirmative, right? So if you're going to read Nietzsche, um, just be aware of the fact that if you're on the left, he is going to say some very, very difficult and horrible things. And rather than trying to downplay that, the best thing to do is to think through it carefully. And I think Tut is right. Take what's valuable and leave the rest behind.
Professor Matt McManus, thank you so much for appearing on the podcast again.
Yeah, no problem, man. Have a good time.
You too. Goodbye.